In this lecture, we are going to talk about fermentation, which really is discussing how we keep the lights on, essentially, when oxygen is low. So when oxygen is low, we need to make sure, the cell needs to make sure that glycolysis can keep running and that the cell can at least get some ATP in the absence of oxygen. This is how some foods are made as well. So humans have captured or have, used fermentation to do all sorts of stuff with the food and beverage industry. So things like kimchi. Kimchi or yogurt are made with fermentation. And then beverages like beer and wine also use the process of fermentation to make alcohol. And so we'll talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between these two types of fermentation here, lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. So fermentation really is the solution to a problem of not having enough oxygen in the environment. Okay, so if oxygen is really low or if oxygen is absent, then it's difficult to produce that 38 ATP from glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And remember, oxygen is acting as the terminal electron acceptor. So here's the problem. If we don't have oxygen or oxygen is really low, then we don't have a terminal electron acceptor. And if there's no terminal electron acceptor, then we end up getting an electron traffic jam. Those electrons can't jump off of the electron transport chain. So what happens is that NADH from glycolysis has nowhere to donate its electrons. And so we get this buildup of NADH inside the cell. Okay, and so if NADH can't give its electrons to the electron transport chain, then what ends up happening is that NAD plus is running out. We're running out of NAD plus. And what needs NAD plus? Remember, this goes back to glycolysis. And so if you don't have, if NAD plus starts running out, then essentially you can't do glycolysis anymore. And so then there's zero ATP production, and then that equals the cell dies. So we don't want that. We don't want the cell to die. It needs to at least get some ATP. Now, this is not always the case for multicellular life, like, for example, a human or an animal that's running really fast. What ends up happening is that the muscle cells are using up the oxygen quicker than it can get delivered. And so we sometimes just need a little boost of ATP, and fermentation is the solution for that. So it's not just when oxygen is absent, it's also when oxygen is running low. Okay, so let's just go through this concept visually here. So remember, here's NADH down here, and NADH is going to give its electrons to the electron transport chain. But the problem is that there's already electrons in the electron transport chain. And if oxygen is low, then they don't have anywhere to jump off, right? So if they don't have oxygen, so oxygen is absent, that means that there's no combination of electrons. Electrons can't jump onto oxygen to form water. So that means there's no water formation because there's no oxygen here. The electrons are stuck on this last proton pump. And so they end up getting backed up. We call it a traffic jam. The electrons cannot move through the electron transport chain anymore. They're stuck. And so if there's already electrons on that I guess, in the electron transport chain, then NADH can't deliver its oxygens or can't donate its electrons to the electron transport chain because it already has electrons. So that means that NADH is not going to be cycled into NAD+. And so now glycolysis doesn't have any NAD+ to keep glycolysis running, and that's the big problem. So the solution is called fermentation. And there's two types of fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation, and there is alcohol fermentation up here, alcohol fermentation. Let's write it in properly. This is alcohol fermentation. All right. So let's start with lactic acid fermentation. So what happens is that instead of going to the Krebs cycle, pyruvate, instead of getting sent to the Krebs cycle, gets converted into something called lactate, or in other words, lactic acid. Remember we said that pyruvate can be called pyruvic acid, citrate can be called citric acid. Well, lactate can also be called lactic acid. So lactic acid, and so that's why it's called lactic acid fermentation. And this process takes some of that NADH and it regenerates NAD+ out of it, and then NAD+ can go back to glycolysis, and glycolysis can keep running. Okay? And you can see, remember, glycolysis is still forming some ATP over here, right? And so we're still getting 2 ATP molecules per glucose. So at least we're getting some, or we're getting a boost. If we're already using oxygen as fast as we can boost our ATP production by producing lactic acid and regenerating that NAD+ faster than the electron transport chain can. It can kind of regenerate that NAD+, so we get this little ATP boost if this is happening in the muscle cells. Okay, so this happens. This is how we make things like yogurt. This is how we make things like kimchi. Okay, lactic acid fermentation is how we make yogurt. It's how we make kimchi. And this is how we, when we're doing really hard exercise, really vigorous exercise, we're using oxygen faster than we can deliver it from our lungs. And so our muscle cells will convert that pyruvate to some of that pyruvate to lactic acid so that we can keep glucose running quickly, get a little extra ATP. Okay, now alcohol fermentation is really similar. Fermentation always starts with glycolysis. So glucose gets converted into pyruvate, right? That process is glycolysis. You already know that. We're taking NAD+ and we're generating NADH out of it. And we're also getting 2 ATP molecules out of that, right? 2 net ATP molecules out of that. But, like I said, the electron transport chain is jammed up, and so this NADH is building up inside the cell, and the cell is running out of NAD+, right? NAD+ is getting low. So we've got low levels of NAD+, and we've got high levels of NADH. And so we have extra NADH that we can burn, right? So what we can do, or what some cells will do, this happens in yeast cells, for example. Okay, remember yeast is used for making bread. It's also used for making alcoholic beverages. Okay, like beer and wine. Or here's another fun one. Makgeolli. Makgeolli also uses yeast. It uses a combination of different stuff, but yeah, yeast. Yeast is definitely involved. Now, here's the trick. These ones have a little bit of an extra step. Okay, the NAD plus regeneration phase is actually in 2 steps. Pyruvate gets changed into, remember, pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. It gets converted into a 2-carbon molecule called ethanol. Okay, but the first step is that it goes from a 3-carbon pyruvate to a 2-carbon intermediate. It's kind of like a halfway point. We'll just call this the 2-carbon. This is a 2-carbon intermediate. You don't need to know what the name of that molecule is, but you need to know that it's 2 carbons. And whenever we lose a carbon, just like in the Krebs cycle, if you ever lose a carbon, right, we lost those carbons as carbon dioxide. Well, whenever you go from a 3-carbon, right, 3 carbons to 2 carbons, then you lose a carbon as carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is produced in that first step, and then we've got the actual NAD plus regeneration as we go from this 2-carbon intermediate to ethanol. And that's going to take our NADH and regenerate or recycle it into NAD plus, and that will go back up to glycolysis, and glycolysis can keep running. Okay, so this is why when you make bread, this is why the bread rises. And when you make beer or makgeolli, you get, it's like carbonated. It makes it bubbly, right? Makes it fizzy. That's because of the carbon dioxide. Okay, so in this one here, pyruvate is converted into that 2-carbon molecule called ethanol, and that process makes carbon dioxide, and it regenerates NAD+, and it makes this alcohol, right? All right, so exercise and energy. Just a reminder that humans, animals use lactic acid fermentation. Okay, we use, let's go like this. Okay, so animals, like humans, use lactic acid fermentation to boost our ATP production during difficult exercise. Okay, and that's because glycolysis is a really fast process. It's faster than the rest of cellular respiration. So converting glucose to pyruvate is a really fast process. So we can actually get a lot of ATP very quickly out of glycolysis if we're also already using oxygen as fast as it can be delivered. Okay, but the problem is that this causes that buildup of pyruvate. And so our cells need to get rid of that pyruvate by a process called, by that process of fermentation, right? Remember, it's lactic acid fermentation that's happening here, right? Specifically, it's lactic acid fermentation. Okay, and so what this does is it causes the pH to decrease, right? And a decrease is that acidity. Remember, an acid has a low pH. So lactic acid, which is an acid, will decrease the pH in our tissues, and that's why you feel that burning sensation in your body, in your muscles, in your lungs when you are exercising really, really vigorously, because those muscles are dumping lactic acid. They're dumping lactic acid into our bloodstream, and that's decreasing the pH of our tissues. Okay, so that's kind of that connection between fermentation and your body. Unicellular life typically can use fermentation as their sole method for energy production. Because remember, unicellular life is really small, right? So they don't need as much energy as an animal that's multicellular, that's moving around, that requires a high amount of ATP. So unicellular life can use fermentation and glycolysis as their primary method of energy production, right? Why is that? It's because they're small in size. Multicellular life, though, they can use fermentation as a boost, just like we described. It can boost our energy production, but because we're so big and we have so many cells that are trying to survive together, we require way too much ATP to just use glycolysis and fermentation as our energy production source.